Chapter 8. We need to talk, Lucy says. She's sitting on the couch, mascara streaked down her cheeks. Oh shit. I drop my purse and rush over to her. As soon as I sit down next to her, she starts crying. What's wrong? Did Alex break up with you? She starts shaking her head, and then I really start freaking out. Please don't say cancer. I grab her hand, and that's when I see it. Lucy, you're engaged? She nods. I'm sorry, I know we still have 6 months left on the lease, but he wants me to move in with him. I stare at her for a minute. Is that why she's crying? Because she wants out of her lease? She reaches for a tissue and starts dabbing at her eyes. I feel awful, Lily. You're going to be all alone. I'm moving and you won't have anyone. What the? Lucy? I'll be fine. I promise. She looks up at me with hope in her expression. Really? Why in the world does she have this impression of me? I nod again. Yes, I'm not mad. I'm happy for you. She throws her arms around me and hugs me. Oh, thank you, Lily. She starts giggling in between bouts of tears. When she releases me, she jumps up and says, I have to go tell Alex. He was so worried you wouldn't let me out of my lease. She grabs her purse and shoes and disappears out the front door. I lie back on the couch and stare up at the ceiling. Did she just play me? I start laughing, because until this moment I had no idea how much I've been waiting for this to happen. The whole place to myself. What's even better is when I do decide to have sex with Ryle, we can have it over here, all the time, and not have to worry about being quiet. The last time I spoke to Ryle was when I left his apartment on Saturday. We agreed on a trial run, no commitments yet, just a relationship feeler to see if it's something we both want. It's now Monday night, and I'm a little disappointed I haven't heard from him. I gave him my phone number before we parted Saturday, but I don't really know texting etiquette, especially for trial runs. Regardless, I'm not texting him first. I decide to occupy my time with teenage angst and Ellen DeGeneres instead. I'm not about to wait around to be beckoned by a guy I'm not even having sex with, but I don't know why I assume that reading about the first guy I've had sex with will somehow get my mind off of the guy I'm not having sex with. Dear Ellen, my great-grandfather's name is Ellis. My entire life I thought this was a really cool name for such an old guy. After he died, I was reading the obituary. Would you believe that Ellis wasn't even his real name? His real name was Levi Sampson, and I had no idea. I asked my grandmother where the name Ellis came from. She said his initials were L.S., and everyone called him by his initials for so long, they just started sounding them out over the years, which is why they referred to him as Ellis. I was looking at your name just now, and it made me think of that. Ellen. Is that even your real name? You could be just like my great-grandfather using your initials as a disguise. L.N. I'm on to you, Ellen. Speaking of names, do you think Atlas is a weird name? It is, isn't it? Yesterday, while I was watching your show with him, I asked him where he got his name from. He said he didn't know. Without even thinking, I told him he should ask his mother why she named him that. He just looked over at me for a second and said, It's a little too late for that. I don't know what he meant by that. I don't know if his mom died or if she gave him up for adoption. We've been friends for a few weeks now, and I still don't really know anything about him or why he doesn't have a place to live. I would just ask him, but I'm not sure if he really trusts me yet. He seems to have trust issues, and I guess I can't blame him. I'm worried about him. It started getting really cold this week, and it's supposed to be even colder next week. If he doesn't have electricity, that means he doesn't have a heater. I hope he at least has blankets. Do you know how awful I would feel if he froze to death? Pretty freaking awful, Ellen. I'll find some blankets this week and give them to him. Lily. Dear Ellen, it's going to start snowing soon, so I decided to harvest my garden today. I had already pulled the radishes, so I just wanted to put some mulch and compost down, which wouldn't have taken me long, but Atlas insisted on helping. He asked me a lot of questions about gardening, and I liked that he seemed interested in my interests. I showed him how to lay the compost and mulch to cover the ground so that the snow wouldn't do too much damage. My garden is small compared to most gardens, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, but it's all my dad will let me use of the backyard. Atlas covered the whole thing while I sat cross-legged in the grass and watched him. I wasn't being lazy, he just took over and wanted to do it, so I let him. I can tell he's a hard worker. I wonder if maybe keeping himself busy takes his mind off of things, and that's why he always wants to help me so much. When he was finished, he walked over and dropped down next to me on the grass. "What made you want to grow things?" he asked. I glanced over at him, and he was sitting cross-legged, looking at me curiously. I realized in that moment that he's probably the best friend I've ever had, and we barely know anything about each other. I have friends at school, but they're never allowed to come over to my house for obvious reasons. My mother is always worried something might happen with my father, and word might get out about his temper. I also never really get to go to other people's houses, but I'm not sure why. Maybe my father doesn't want me staying over at friends' houses because I might witness how a good husband is supposed to treat his wife. He probably wants me to believe the way he treats my mother is normal. Atlas is the first friend I've ever had that's ever been inside my house. He's also the first friend to know how much I like to garden. And now, he's the first friend to ever ask me why I garden. I reached down and pulled at a weed and started tearing it into little pieces while I thought about his question. When I was 10, my mother got me a subscription to a website called Seeds Anonymous, I said. Every month, I would get an unmarked package of seeds in the mail with instructions on how to plant them and care for them. I wouldn't know what I was growing until it came up out of the ground. Every day after school, I'd run straight to the backyard to see the progress. It gave me something to look forward to. Growing things felt like a reward. I could feel Atlas staring at me when he asked, "A reward for what?" I shrugged. "For loving my plants the right way. Plants reward you based on the amount of love you show them. If you're cruel to them or neglect them, they give you nothing. But if you care for them and love them the right way, they reward you with gifts in the form of vegetables or fruits or flowers." I looked down at the weed I was tearing apart in my hands, and there was barely an inch left of it. I wadded it up between my fingers and flicked it. I didn't want to look over at Atlas because I could still feel him staring, so instead, I just stared out over my mulch-covered garden. "We're just alike," he said. My eyes flicked to his. "Me and you?" He shook his head. "No, plants and humans. Plants need to be loved the right way in order to survive. So do humans. We rely on our parents from birth to love us enough to keep us alive, and if our parents show us the right kind of love, we turn out as better humans overall, but if we're neglected, his voice grew quiet, almost sad. He wiped his hands on his knees, trying to get some of the dirt off. If we're neglected, we end up homeless and incapable of anything meaningful. His words made my heart feel like the mulch he had just laid out. I didn't even know what to say to that. Does he really think that about himself? He acted like he was about to get up, but before he did, I said his name. He sat back down in the grass. I pointed at the row of trees that lined the fence to the left of the yard. You see that tree over there? In the middle of the row of trees was an oak tree that stood taller than the rest of the trees. Atlas glanced over at it and dragged his eyes all the way up to the top of the tree. It grew on its own, I said. Most plants do need a lot of care to survive, but some things, like trees, are strong enough to do it just by relying on themselves and nobody else. I had no idea if he knew what I was trying to say without me coming out and saying it, but I just wanted him to know that I thought he was strong enough to survive whatever was going on in his life. I didn't know him well, but I could tell he was resilient. Way more than I would ever be if I were in his situation. His eyes were glued to the tree. It was a long time before he even blinked. When he finally did, he just nodded a little and looked down at the grass. I thought with the way his mouth twitched that he was about to frown, but instead, he actually smiled a little. Seeing that smile made my heart feel like I had just startled it right out of a dead sleep. We're just alike, he said, repeating himself from earlier. Plants and humans? I asked. He shook his head. No, me and you. I gasped, Ellen. I hope he didn't notice, but I definitely sucked in a rush of air, because what the heck was I supposed to say? I just sat there really awkward and quiet until he stood up. He turned like he was about to walk home. Atlas, wait. He glanced back down at me. I pointed at his hands and said, You might want to take a quick shower before you go back. Compost is made of cow manure. He lifted his hands and looked down at them, and then he looked down at his compost-covered clothes. Cow manure? Seriously? I grinned and nodded. He laughed a little, and then, before I knew it, he was on the ground next to me, wiping his hands all over me. We were both laughing as he reached to the bag next to us and stuck his hand inside, then smeared it down my arms. Ellen, I am confident that the next sentence I'm about to write has never been written or spoken aloud before. When he was wiping that cow shit on me, it was quite possibly the most turned on I have ever been. After a few minutes, we were both lying on the ground, breathing hard, still laughing. He finally stood up and pulled me to my feet, knowing he couldn't waste minutes if he wanted a shower before my parents came home. Once he was in the shower, I washed my hands in the sink and just stood there, wondering what he meant earlier when he said we were just alike. Was it a compliment? It sure felt like one. Was he saying that he thought I was strong too? Because I certainly didn't feel strong most of the time. In that moment, just thinking about him made me feel weak. I wondered what I was going to do about the way I was starting to feel when I was around him. I also wondered how long I could keep hiding him from my parents and how long he'll be staying at that house. Winters in Maine are unbearably cold, and he won't survive without a heater or blankets. I gathered myself and went in search of all the spare blankets I could find. I was going to give them to him when he got out of the shower, but it was already 5 and he left in a hurry. I'll give them to him tomorrow. Lily. Dear Ellen, Harry Connick Jr. is freaking hilarious. I'm not sure if you've ever had him on your show because I hate to admit I've probably missed an episode or two since you've been on the air. But if you've never had him, you should. Actually, have you ever watched Late Night with Conan O'Brien? He has this guy named Andy who sits on the couch for every episode. I wish Harry could sit on your couch for every episode. He just has the best one-liners, and the two of you together would be epic. I just want to say thank you. I know that you don't have a show on TV for the sole purpose of making me laugh, but sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes my life just makes me feel like I've lost the ability to laugh or smile. But then I turn on your show, and no matter what mood I'm in when I turn on the TV, I always feel better by the time your show is over. So, yeah, thanks for that. I know you probably want an update on Atlas, and I'll give you one in a second. But first, I need to tell you about what happened yesterday. My mother is a teaching assistant over at Brymer Elementary. It's a bit of a drive, and that's why she never gets home until around 5 o'clock. My dad works 2 miles from here, so he's always home right after 5. We have a garage, but only one car can fit in it because of all of my dad's stuff. My dad keeps his car in the garage, and my mom keeps her car in the driveway. Well, yesterday, my mom got home a little bit early. Atlas was still at the house, and we were almost finished watching your show when I heard the garage door start to open. He ran out the back door, and I rushed around the living room cleaning up our soda cans and snacks. It had started snowing really hard around lunchtime yesterday, and my mother had a lot of stuff to carry in, so she pulled up in the garage so she could bring it all in through the kitchen door. It was work stuff and a few groceries. I was helping her bring everything inside when my dad pulled up in the driveway. He started honking his horn because he was mad that my mom was parked in the garage. I guess he didn't want to have to get out of his car in the snow. That's the only thing I can think of that would make him want her to move her car right then and there instead of just waiting until she was finished unloading it. Come to think of it, why does my father always get the garage? You would think a man wouldn't want the woman he loves to get the shittier parking spot. Anyway, my mother got that real scared look in her eye when he started honking, and she told me to take all of her stuff to the table while she moved the car out. I'm not sure what happened when she went back outside. I heard a crash, and then I heard her scream, so I ran to the garage thinking she had slipped on ice. Ellen, I don't want to describe what happened next. I'm still a little shocked by the whole thing. I opened the garage door and didn't see my mom. I just saw my dad behind the car doing something. I took a step closer and realized why I couldn't see my mom. He had her pushed down on the hood with his hands around her throat. He was choking her, Ellen. I might cry just thinking about it. He was yelling at her, staring down at her with so much hatred, something about not having respect for how hard he works. I don't know why. He was so mad, really, because all I could hear was her silence while she struggled to breathe. The next few minutes are a blur, but I know I started screaming at him. I jumped on his back, and I was hitting him on the side of his head. Then I wasn't. I don't really know what happened, but I'm guessing he threw me off of him. I just remembered 1 second I was on his back, and the next second I was on the ground and my forehead hurt, like you wouldn't believe. My mom was sitting next to me, holding my head and telling me she was sorry. I looked around for my dad, but he wasn't there. He'd gotten into his car and drove off after I hit my head. My mom gave me a rag and told me to hold it to my head because it was bleeding, and then she helped me to her car and drove me to the hospital. On the way there, she only said one thing to me. When they ask you what happened, tell them you slipped on the ice. When she said that, I just looked out my window and started crying because I thought for sure this was the final straw. That she would leave him now that he had hurt me. That was the moment I realized she'd never leave him. I felt so defeated, but I was too scared to say anything to her about it. I had to get 9 stitches on my forehead. I'm still not sure what I hit my head on, but it doesn't really matter. The fact is, my father was the reason I was hurt, and he didn't even stay to check on me. He just left us both there on the floor of the garage and left. I got home really late last night and fell right to sleep because they had given me some kind of pain pill. This morning, when I walked to the bus, I tried not to look directly at Atlas so he wouldn't see my forehead. I had fixed my hair so that you couldn't really see it, and he didn't notice right away. When we sat down next to each other on the bus, our hands touched when we were putting our stuff on the floor. His hands were like ice, Ellen. Ice! That's when I realized that I forgot to give him the blankets I had pulled out for him yesterday because my mother got home sooner than I expected. The incident in the garage sort of took over all my thoughts, and I completely forgot about him. It had snowed and iced all night, and he had been over there at that house in the dark all by himself, and now he was so cold I didn't know how he was even functioning. I grabbed both of his hands in mine and said, "Atlas, you're freezing." He didn't say anything. I just started rubbing his hands in mine to warm them up. I laid my head on his shoulder, and then I did the most embarrassing thing. I just started to cry. I don't cry very much, but I was still so upset by what happened yesterday, and that I was feeling so guilty that I forgot to take him blankets, and it all hit me right there on the ride to school. He didn't say anything. He just pulled his hands from mine so I'd stop rubbing them, and then he laid his hands on top of mine. We just sat there like that the whole ride to school with our heads leaned together and his hands on top of mine. I might have thought it was sweet if it wasn't so sad. On the ride home from school is when he finally noticed my head. Honestly, I had forgotten about it. No one at school even asked me about it, and when he sat down next to me on the bus, I wasn't even trying to hide it with my hair. He looked right at me and said, "What happened to your head?" I didn't know what to say to him. I just touched it with my fingers and then looked out the window. I've been trying to get him to trust me more in hopes he would tell me why he doesn't have a place to live, so I didn't want to lie to him. I just didn't want to tell him the truth either. When the bus started moving, he said, "Yesterday, after I left your house, I heard something going on over there. I heard yelling, I heard you scream, and then I saw your father leave. I was going to come check on you to make sure everything was okay, but as I was walking over, I saw you leaving in the car with your mother." He must have heard the fight in the garage and saw her leaving to take me to get the stitches. I couldn't believe he came over to our house. Do you know what my dad would do to him if he saw him wearing his clothes? I got so worried for him because I don't think he knows what my father is capable of. I looked at him and said, "Atlas, you can't do that. You can't come to my house when my parents are home." Atlas got quiet and then said, "I heard you scream, Lily." He said it like me being in danger trumped anything else. I felt bad because I know he was just trying to help, but that would have made things so much worse. "I fell," I said to him. As soon as I said it, I felt bad for lying, and to be honest, he looked a little disappointed in me because I think we both knew in that moment that it wasn't as simple as a fall. Then he pulled up the sleeve of his shirt and held out his arm. Ellen, my stomach dropped. It was so bad. All over his arm, he had these small scars. Some of the scars looked just like someone had stuck a cigarette to his arm and held it there. He twisted his arm around so I could see that it was on the other side too. I used to fall a lot too, Lily. Then he pulled his shirt sleeve down and didn't say anything else. For a second, I wanted to tell him it wasn't like that my dad never hurts me, and that he was just trying to get me off of him. But then I realized I'd be using the same excuses my mom uses. I felt a little embarrassed that he knows what goes on in my house. I spent the rest of the bus drive looking out the window because I didn't know what to say to him. When we got home, my mom's car was there. In the driveway, of course, not the garage. That meant Atlas couldn't come over and watch your show with me. I was going to tell him I would bring him blankets later, but when he got off the bus, he didn't even tell me bye. He just started walking down the street like he was mad. It's dark now, and I'm waiting on my parents to go to sleep. But in a little while, I'm going to take him some blankets. Lily. Dear Ellen, I'm in way over my head. Do you ever do things you know are wrong, but somehow also right? I don't know how to put it in simpler terms than that. I mean, I'm only 15 and certainly shouldn't have boys spending the night in my bedroom, but if a person knows someone needs a place to stay, isn't it that person's responsibility as a human to help them? Last night, after my parents went to sleep, I snuck out the back door to take Atlas those blankets. I took a flashlight with me because it was dark. It was still snowing really hard, so by the time I made it to that house, I was freezing. I beat on the back door, and as soon as he opened it, I pushed past him to get out of the cold. Only, I didn't get out of the cold. Somehow it felt even colder inside that house. I still had my flashlight on and shined it around the living room and kitchen. There wasn't anything in there, Ellen. No couch, no chairs, no mattress. I handed the blankets off to him and kept looking around me. There was a big hole in the roof over the kitchen, and wind and snow were just pouring in. When I shined my light around the living room, I saw his stuff in one of the corners, his backpack, plus the backpack I'd give him. There was a little pile of other stuff I'd given him, like some of my dad's clothes, and then there were 2 towels on the floor. One I guess he laid on, and one I guess he covered up with. I put my hand over my mouth because I was so horrified. He'd been living there like that for weeks. Atlas put his hand on my back and tried to walk me out the door. You shouldn't be over here, Lily, he said. You could get in trouble. That's when I grabbed his hand and said, You shouldn't be here either. I started to pull him out the front door with me, but he yanked his hand back. That's when I said, You can sleep on my floor tonight. I'll keep my bedroom door locked. You can't sleep here, Atlas. It's too cold and you'll get pneumonia and die. He looked like he didn't know what to do. I'm sure the thought of being caught in my bedroom was just as scary as getting pneumonia and dying. He looked back at his spot in the living room, and then he just nodded his head once and said, Okay. So you tell me, Ellen, was I wrong letting him sleep in my room last night? It doesn't feel wrong. It felt like the right thing to do, but I sure would get in a lot of trouble if we had been caught. He slept on the floor, so it's not like it was anything more than me just giving him somewhere warm to sleep. I did learn a little more about him last night. After I snuck him in the back door and into my room, I locked my door and made a pallet for him on the floor next to my bed. I set the alarm for 6 a.m. and told him he'd have to get up and leave before my parents wake up, since sometimes my mom wakes me up in the mornings. I crawled in my bed and scooted over the edge of it so I could look down at him while we talked for a little while. I asked him how long he thought he might stay there, and he said he didn't know. That's when I asked him how he ended up there. My lamp was still on, and we were whispering, but he got real quiet when I said that. He just stared up at me with his hands behind his head for a moment. Then he said, I don't know my real dad. He never had anything to do with me. It's always just been me and my mom. But she got remarried about 5 years ago to a guy who never really liked me much. We fought a lot. When I turned 18 a few months ago, we got in a big fight and he kicked me out of the house. He took a deep breath, like he didn't want to tell me anymore. But then he started talking again. I've been staying with a friend of mine and his family ever since, but his dad got a transfer to Colorado and they moved. They couldn't take me with them, of course. His parents were just being nice by letting me stay with them, and I knew that. So I told them, I talked to my mom, and that I was moving back home. The day they left, I didn't have anywhere to go, so I went back home and told my mom I'd like to move back in until I graduated. She wouldn't let me. Said it would upset my stepfather. He turned his head and looked at the wall. So I just wandered around for a few days until I saw that house. Figured I would just stay there until something better came along or until I graduated. I'm signed up to go to the Marines come May, so I'm just trying to hang on until then. May is 6 months away, Ellen. 6. I had tears in my eyes when he finished telling me all of that. I asked him why he didn't just ask someone if they could help him. He said he tried, but it's harder for an adult than a kid, and he's already 18. He said someone gave him a number for some shelters who might help him. There were 3 shelters in a 20-mile radius of our town, but 2 of them were for battered women. The other one was a homeless shelter, but they only had a few beds, and it was too far away for him to walk there if he wanted to go to school every day. Plus, you have to wait in a long line to try and get a bed. He said he tried it once, but he feels safer in that old house than he did at the shelter. Like the naive girl I am when it comes to situations like this, I said, but aren't there other options? Can't you just tell the school counselor what your mom did? He shook his head and said, he's too old for foster care. He's 18, so his mother can't get in trouble for not allowing him to go back home. He said he called about getting food stamps last week, but he didn't have a ride or money to get to his appointment. Not to mention he doesn't have a car, so he can't very well find a job. He said he's been looking, though. After he leaves my house in the afternoons, he goes and applies at places, but he doesn't have an address or a phone number to put down on the applications, so that makes it harder for him. I swear, Ellen, every question I threw at him, he had an answer for. It's like he's tried everything not to be stuck in the situation he's in, but there isn't enough help out there for people like him. I got so mad at his whole situation. I told him he was crazy for wanting to go into the military. I wasn't so much whispering when I said, why in the heck would you want to serve a country that has allowed you to end up in this kind of situation? You know what he said next, Ellen? His eyes grew sad and he said, it's not this country's fault my mother doesn't give a shit about me. Then he reached up and turned off my lamp. Good night, Lily, he said. I didn't sleep much after that. I was too mad. I'm not even sure who I'm mad at. I just kept thinking about our country and the whole world and how screwed up it is that people don't do more for each other. I don't know when humans started only looking out for themselves. Maybe it's always been this way. It made me wonder how many people out there were just like Atlas. It made me wonder if there were other kids at our school who might be homeless. I go to school every day and internally complain about it most of the time, but I have never once thought that school might be the only home some kids have. It's the only place Atlas can go and know he'll have food. I'll never be able to respect rich people now, knowing they willingly choose to spend their money on materialistic things rather than using it to help other people. No offense, Ellen. I know you're rich, but I guess I'm not referring to people like you. I've seen all the stuff you've done for others on your show and all the charities you support. But I know there are a lot of rich people out there who are selfish. Hell, there are even selfish poor people and selfish middle class people. Look at my parents. We aren't rich, but we certainly aren't too poor to help other people. Yet, I don't think my dad has ever done anything for a charity. I remember one time we were walking into a grocery store and an old man was ringing a bell for the Salvation Army. I asked my dad if we could give him some money, and he told me no, that he works too hard for his money, and he wasn't about to let me give it away. He said, it isn't his fault that other people don't want to work. He spent the whole time we were in the grocery store telling me about how people take advantage of the government, and until the government stops helping those people by giving them handouts, the problem will never go away. Ellen, I believed him. That was 3 years ago, and all this time I thought homeless people were homeless because they were lazy or drug addicts or just didn't want to work like other people. But now I know that's not true. Sure, some of what he said was true to an extent, but he was using the worst case scenarios. Not everyone is homeless because they choose to be. They're homeless because there isn't enough help to go around. And people like my father are the problem. Instead of helping others, people use the worst case scenarios to excuse their own selfishness and greed. I'll never be like that. I swear to you, when I grow up, I'm going to do everything I can to help other people. I'll be like you, Ellen. Just probably not as rich. Lily.